At dawn in the silent reaches of Winter Mesa, the earth trembled, not violently, but softly, like something deep beneath the soil was taking its first breath in 60 years. Across the red dust fields, a weathered veteran stood beside a gaping hole in the ground, and his German shepherd suddenly stiffened, ears sharp, eyes fixed on the darkness below, as if he could see what no human ever could. There was no wind, no birds, only the faint rhythmic pulse of the land, beating like an ancient heart, waking after too long a sleep. Then it came, a low echo rising from the depths, trembling through stone and bone alike. A whisper of something buried, alive, forgotten, and no longer content to stay hidden. If you're watching this right now, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because from this moment on, the truth begins to rise. The sun over Redstone Valley did not rise so much as it pressed itself upon the world, heavy, merciless, and white-hot. By late afternoon, the land looked less like a valley and more like a forgotten wound in the earth, cracked open and left to dry beneath a sky that had not offered rain in nearly a year. Dust clung to every surface like a second skin. Even the wind, when it bothered to move, carried the taste of old earth and dying grass. Elias Granger stood on the warped porch of his small wooden house, staring out at the withering expanse of his ranch. He had fought in deserts on the other side of the world, survived ambushes, explosions, and nights that seemed intent on swallowing him whole, but nothing felt as hopeless as watching his land die inch by inch right beneath his boots. Beside him stood Bear, his 7-year-old German shepherd, fur black, with streaks of silver along the neck and tail, eyes sharp as polished amber. Bear was more than a companion, he was a lifeline, a trained PTSD service dog who had learned to read the storms behind Elias's eyes long before Elias could describe them. When the world tilted, Bear steadied him. When memories clawed at him in the dark, Bear brought him back. Now, Bear stood perfectly still, nose lifted as if catching some scent Elias could not. "You feel it too," Elias murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. Perhaps he just needed someone, or something, to hear the words. On the kitchen table behind them lay an unopened envelope stamped with the cold geometry of a bank logo. Elias didn't need to open it. He knew exactly what it contained. He had already received 2 like it that month, the final notice, the polite but merciless language of foreclosure, a deadline, a closing noose. 2 weeks, maybe less, and Redstone Valley Ranch, the last thing his father had left him, would be gone. Bear nudged his hand gently with a cold nose, sensing the shift in Elias's breathing before Elias could even register it. "I know, boy," Elias whispered. "I'm trying." But trying wasn't enough. Not anymore. His gaze drifted across the dying grass toward the northern stretch of his land, where the ground dipped unnaturally in a perfect circle. Even from the porch, Elias could feel the temperature drop around that spot, as though the sunlight itself refused to touch it. A ring of earth darker than the rest of the valley, yawning down into a shadow that seemed bottomless. Locals called it the Mouth of Eden, a name passed down through old stories, whispered warnings, and uneasy glances. A hole no one had ever managed to fill, a hole that swallowed rain, rocks, tools, and once, according to rumor, a full-grown bull. Children were told not to wander near it. Adults simply ignored it with the kind of deliberate avoidance that came from generations of superstition. Elias had avoided it too, until the drought stripped away every other option. If there was an aquifer beneath his land, one untouched by the valley's collapse, it would be there. The geography suggested it. The weird drop in soil temperature, the lack of vegetation around it. The old geological survey he'd found in a county file, barely legible but enough to spark the faintest sliver of hope. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was all he had left. He picked up his hat, pulled on his gloves, and stepped down from the porch. "Come on, Bear." The dog followed without hesitation, though his ears were slightly back, his tail low, a posture that made something inside Elias twitch. Bear rarely showed discomfort. Fear was practically foreign to him. They reached the rusted metal shed, where Elias kept his old excavator. The machine coughed and groaned as it rumbled to life, belching a cloud of smoke that quickly dissolved into the shimmering heat. Elias climbed into the cab and steered toward the mouth of Eden. Bear trotted ahead, pausing every few steps to sniff the air and glance back with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. Sunlight dimmed slightly as they approached the circular void. Not because of clouds, there were none, but because the hole seemed to draw in light the way lungs drew in breath. Elias had never stood this close before. The edges were dry and cracked, but the center dipped into darkness so pure it looked like ink. A faint, cool breeze drifted upward from the depth, cool in a valley where everything else burned. Elias shut off the machine and jumped down. "It's now or never," he whispered to himself. But the second he reached for the lever to swing the excavator's arm, Bear erupted. A deep guttural growl tore from the dog's chest, so sudden and fierce that Elias startled backward. Bear raced to the edge of the hole, barking with explosive urgency. His body stiffened, fur rising along his spine, tail out straight like a warning flag. "Bear, enough!" Elias commanded. But Bear didn't even look at him. He barked again and again, circling the edge of the hole, blocking Elias's approach like he was defending him from something he couldn't see. Elias's pulse hammered. He had seen Bear alert to danger before. Snakes, coyotes, a mountain lion once. But this was different. This wasn't alertness. This was panic. "Hey, what is it?" Elias tried again, approaching slowly. Bear snarled, not at Elias, but toward the hole, low and trembling, the kind of sound a dog makes when instinct screams louder than training. Something cold pressed into Elias's spine. He stepped closer, peered into the void. Nothing moved, nothing changed. It was just a hole, that Bear was ready to fight. Elias crouched and put a steady hand on Bear's neck. The dog was shaking. "Okay," Elias whispered, voice low. "We won't get too close, but we have to look around. Just around it, not inside." Bear's ears twitched. He didn't like it, but he didn't bolt either. So Elias walked a slow circle around the rim, studying the soil. The ground felt softer in certain spots, as if disturbed long ago. Bear pressed against his leg the whole way, never once turning his back to the darkness. Elias's boots stopped near a ridge of earth that looked slightly raised, like something buried beneath. He knelt, brushed away a handful of packed soil. Something metallic glinted. A shudder traveled down his arms. He brushed more vigorously. A curved line of cold iron emerged beneath his fingers. He froze. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't natural. It was part of something man-made, something hidden just beneath the surface, a few feet from the mouth of Eden. Bear barked sharply, pacing behind him, tail stiff with fear. Elias swallowed hard. "This isn't right," he murmured. The hole was no simple geological oddity. The dryness, the cold air, the unnatural symmetry, the metallic structure buried beside it. Suddenly, the entire valley felt too quiet. Elias stood, wiped his dusty hands on his jeans, and looked down at Bear, who was still watching the hole with the haunted focus of a creature sensing something older and darker than human understanding. "Okay, boy," Elias whispered. "We're not done, but we're not going in blind." Bear pressed his head against Elias's thigh, trembling once before steadying himself again. Elias exhaled slowly. He had come searching for water. But it was clear now, the mouth of Eden held something else entirely, something his dog recognized before he did, and something was about to pull him deeper than he had ever planned to go. The next morning came without warmth, as if even the sun hesitated to touch the valley. Elias Granger woke early, though it would be more accurate to say he never truly slept. His mind replayed Bear's frantic reaction again and again. The barking, the trembling, the unmistakable fear in a dog who had never known fear. Bear lay beside the bed, head on his paws, eyes half open but alert. Every few minutes, his ears twitched toward the window, as though listening for something Elias could not hear. Elias sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed the dog's head gently. "We're going back out," he said quietly. "But I promise, I'll be careful." Bear didn't wag his tail. He simply rose and pressed his head against Elias's hip, a silent statement of both trust and worry. Elias dressed, drank black coffee that tasted like dust and old hope, and stepped outside. The valley air carried a faint chill, unnatural for early summer. Bear padded close to his side, his gait tense. The mouth of Eden waited in the distance, a circular depression dark and still, almost pulsing with quiet invitation. Or warning. Today, Elias didn't intend to approach the hole directly. Something in Bear's reaction the day before had forced him to reconsider his plan. Instead, he decided to search the ground around it, carefully, deliberately, for any sign of water, cracks in the soil, or anything that might explain the strange behavior. He grabbed a shovel, slung a canteen over his shoulder, and walked with Bear toward the northern pasture. Dust rose in small puffs beneath their boots and paws. The ranch seemed unusually silent. No birds, no insects. Even the wind had abandoned the valley this morning. When they reached the perimeter of the hole, Bear immediately stiffened, but he didn't bark this time. Instead, he followed Elias closely, his nose glued to the earth, body rigid as drawn wire. Elias knelt where he had uncovered the faint glint of something metallic the day before. He started to dig again, not toward the hole, but along the raised line he had noticed. Bear circled him twice before settling in front of him, watching the mouth of Eden without blinking. Bit by bit, Elias scraped away packed dirt, revealing more of the metallic curve buried beneath. The soil here had a different consistency, heavier, colder. It clung to his gloves as though reluctant to let go. After several minutes, the shovel made a sound that startled him. Clang! A deep, hollow sound, metal striking metal. Elias froze. The echo trembled through the ground, subtle but unmistakable, as though it traveled along unseen channels far below. Bear snapped his head toward Elias, letting out a sharp bark, one that carried confusion, alarm, and recognition all at once. Elias brushed aside the loose earth with his hands until his fingers struck something solid. He leaned closer. It wasn't a metal frame or a pipe. It was a steel surface, curved slightly, thick with rust, but undeniably artificial. His chest tightened. He kept digging, widening the exposed patch until his gloves found an edge, a lip in the metal where it met the earth. With careful pressure, he pried the soil free, revealing more of the structure. Another clang answered his movements, deeper this time. For a moment, Elias wondered if he had awakened something old and buried, something that had been waiting under the valley long before he was born. He pushed that thought away. Probably just an old irrigation tank, he told Bear, though he did not believe his own words. Nothing about this structure matched any tank he had ever seen on a ranch. Bear let out a sharp, quiet whine. Elias's breath quickened as he uncovered a straight line in the metal, then another, and another. They intersected, forming a perfect corner, not a tank, a hatch. He stepped back, stunned. The shape became clearer the more dirt he swept away. A heavy steel cover, roughly the size of a large square table. The surface bore faint brushstrokes of blue paint, now chipped and worn. And at the center, a recessed wheel, a locking mechanism. Elias swallowed hard. The world seemed suddenly smaller, as if the valley itself leaned in to listen. Bear growled low, stepping forward until his body blocked part of the metal slab. "It's okay," Elias whispered. But he didn't believe that either. He knelt, wiping dirt from the surface. Beneath the rust and time-stained grime, he uncovered faded letters, stenciled in a style he knew too well from his years of military service. Project Earth Dive, 1963. The words hit him like a blow. He ran his fingertips over the lettering as if touching them would somehow anchor him to reality. Why here? Why on his land? Why buried beside a hole that locals had feared for generations? Bear barked again, loud this time, startled by the sudden trembling in Elias's hands. Elias forced himself to breathe. "This can't be," he whispered. But it was. The hatch was real. The lettering was real. And Project Earth Dive, if the name was genuine, was no casual pipeline or abandoned ranch utility. The markings were older, colder, and undeniably federal. Elias stepped back, staring at the hidden structure as the morning sun climbed higher. Sweat gathered on his brow, though the air had grown even colder around the hatch. Bear paced in tight circles, barking in short bursts, as if urging Elias to back away. "What are you sensing?" Elias asked quietly. Bear stopped barking and placed a gentle but firm paw on Elias's boot, a grounding gesture, a warning, a plea. Elias recognized that gesture intimately. Bear had used it only twice before, in Afghanistan, when an IED lay buried beneath 10 inches of sand, and once in the mountains when they encountered a cougar stalking the ridge. Bear was telling him that something dangerous lay beneath them. "We won't open it," Elias said. "Not today." Bear's tail remained still. Elias stepped away from the hatch, taking a long look at the hole, at the unnatural stillness around them, at the way the sunlight bent upon reaching the edges of the depression. Something about the hole and the hatch felt connected. Two pieces of a puzzle he was not meant to solve, not alone. He took out his phone, snapped a few pictures, and slipped it back into his pocket. His hands shook slightly. He tried to hide it from Bear, though the dog likely already knew. "We'll come back," Elias said, "but we need a plan, and maybe someone who knows more than I do." Bear walked close beside him as they left the site, never once looking away from the soil covering the hatch. As they made their way back across the dying pasture, a strange unease crept over Elias. He kept replaying the moment the shovel struck steel, the hollow resonance that felt almost like an answer, or a warning. He didn't know which one frightened him more. By the time they reached the house, Bear's posture had softened slightly, though he still cast glances over his shoulder, ears twitching at sounds Elias couldn't hear. Elias removed his gloves and stared at the dirt on them. Something had been buried beneath his land for more than half a century. Something man-made, sealed, and forgotten by time, but not by purpose. And Bear had understood the danger before Elias even touched the soil. A chill crawled up his spine. Whatever Project Earthdive was, it wasn't meant for the light, and yet he had unearthed it. Not fully, not intentionally, but enough. Enough to disturb the ground beneath his life, his memories, and the legacy of the father he had lost too soon. Elias closed his eyes briefly and whispered into the quiet house. "What have I dug up, Dad?" Bear pressed against his leg. Outside, the valley remained silent, listening, waiting. Elias Granger didn't return to the house right away. After uncovering the hatch, he had intended to regroup, think, but thinking had a way of unraveling into old memories he wasn't ready to face. So, instead, he walked. Not toward the ranch or the shed or the porch, where yesterday's notice still lay unopened, but toward the southern ridge, where the wind finally seemed to breathe again. Bear walked beside him, quieter than usual, as if drained by what he'd sensed in the dirt. Every few steps, he glanced north, toward the hidden hatch, his ears flattening a little each time. Elias noted the fear. He didn't blame him. Fear was a language they both understood too well. When they reached the ridge, Elias sat on a boulder that had warmed under the early sun. Bear sat at his feet, leaning lightly against his boots. The silence pressed around them, thick and heavy. Elias rubbed his eyes. "Project Earthdive," he murmured. The name tasted metallic. Wrong. 1963. He tried to imagine what could have driven the government to bury a sealed hatch beside a natural anomaly like the mouth of Eden. And then, impulsively, stupidly, he wondered if his father had known. No. That was the kind of thought that crept in when sleep was thin and ghosts were loud. Bear nudged his hand, a grounding gesture that eased the worst of the tension. "Yeah," Elias whispered. "I'm here." They sat that way for a long while, until Bear's head suddenly jerked up, his body going rigid. He stared at the horizon, not north, but west. Elias followed his gaze. A faint tremor rippled underfoot. So subtle Elias almost missed it. The ground stilled. The wind died again. Bear growled, low and cautious. Not the panic sound from yesterday, but a predator's warning. Something had shifted. Something old. Elias stood. Every nerve in his body tightened. He scanned the valley. Nothing moved. Even the dust slept. Then, a faint metallic tick echoed from the north. Not from the hatch, not from the hole, from deeper, lower, as if the ground itself had exhaled. Bear tensed, tail straight, muscles bunching beneath his dark fur. Elias felt the prickle of instinct run cold down his spine. "I heard it," he whispered. The sound came again, barely audible, swallowed quickly by the valley, but unmistakable. Not natural, not geological, mechanical, no. He told himself he was overreacting. The heat was playing tricks on his senses. Metal contracted, expanded. Old structures moved, nothing more. But Bear was still rigid, and Bear never imagined things. Elias moved down the ridge at a brisk walk, Bear close on his heels. He headed straight for the old tool shed, a structure older than he was, leaning slightly from decades of desert wind. Inside were things that had belonged to his father: maps, survey documents, battered equipment Elias had never thrown away, even after Samuel's unexpected death. He needed context, something to tell him what Earthdive was, and why it was hidden on his land. The shed door groaned loudly as he pulled it open. Dust danced in the slanted light. Inside, he found the usual chaos of rusted tools and warped wooden crates. But on the highest shelf sat a metal lockbox Elias hadn't opened in years. He retrieved it, set it on the workbench, and pried it open. Inside were folders, yellowed with age, edges curled, but all carefully labeled in Samuel Granger's meticulous handwriting. Elias's fingers hovered. He didn't want his father tangled in this, didn't want to believe any connection existed. But the hatch had been built in 1963, and Samuel Granger had worked for the Department of Energy from 1962 to 1965. He picked up the first folder. Subterranean Pressure Anomalies. 1962 detailed maps of Redstone Valley, including the northern pasture. Notes written in tight cursive about seismic irregularities underground. Cavity formations. 1963 sketches of subsurface voids. One shape stood out, a near-perfect cylinder, a hole, not a natural one. Elias felt heat rise in his chest. He opened the next file. Natural Resource Viability Report. Redstone. The cover was marked Confidential. Inside was a printed memo. Area exhibits inexplicable flux in subterranean temperature and mineral density. Recommend further analysis before Project Earthdive construction proceeds. His father had annotated the page. Eden cavity unstable. Soil composition unusual. Something is wrong. Eden cavity. Elias swallowed. His father had used the name long before the locals adopted it. Bear whimpered softly, stepping back from the table. Elias turned to the last sheet in the folder, a single line. Recommend termination of Earthdive until risks assessed. And beneath that, a signature. Dr. Samuel Granger. The room seemed to tilt. Elias sat heavily on the stool beside the bench, elbows on his knees, staring at the documents like they were shards of a broken truth. His father had warned them, and they had built something anyway. A hatch, a chamber, a locked structure buried beside a hole the earth itself rejected. Elias forced himself to breathe, slow and steady, grounding on Bear's presence beside him. He looked out the shed door toward the horizon. The hole lay beyond the dry fields, invisible from here, but impossibly present. The hatch lay concealed beneath dirt he'd disturbed, and something beneath it, something heavy, mechanical, alive in its forgotten way, had made itself known. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He placed the documents in his jacket, locked the shed, and walked back toward the house. Only halfway there did he notice the dust plume rising from the far western road. A vehicle. He froze. Bear growled, stepping in front of him. The plume grew larger, closer. Elias backed up instinctively, hand tightening reflexively into a fist. The plume stopped, far away, barely, visible beyond a distant ridge, before turning sharply south toward the highway. No one came to Redstone Valley unless they had business. And Elias had not invited anyone. Unease threaded through him, quiet and sharp. "Come on, Bear," he said. "Let's get inside." Bear didn't move. Instead, he continued staring at the point where the dust trail had vanished, his posture rigid, breath slowing, ears focused. A warning, a line drawn. Eventually, Bear stepped back and followed Elias to the house. But even after the door closed, the dog remained by the window, watching the valley with unwavering vigilance. Elias dropped the folders onto the table and pressed both hands against the wood. Earthdive, a hatch buried beside an unnatural hole. a tremor in the earth, a sound under the soil, a dust plume from a road that rarely saw visitors, and his father, caught in the middle of it decades ago. He didn't know what waited under the valley, but he knew this. He could no longer pretend the past was dead. Whatever Earthdive had hidden, it remembered, and it was not finished. Evening arrived early in Redstone Valley, as if the sun had grown impatient with the land and decided to abandon it before its job was done. The sky dimmed into a bruised shade of purple, and the air cooled with a swiftness that felt unnatural for late summer. Elias Granger sat at his small kitchen table, documents spread around him like the broken pieces of a truth too large to hold. Bear lay at the door, head up, eyes fixed on the outside world with the unwavering vigilance of a creature who understood danger long before humans did. Elias had been reading the same line again and again. Recommend termination of Earthdive until risks assessed. His father's handwriting, his father's warning, his father's silence. He closed the folder slowly, letting the paper exhale a soft sigh of age. Something in his chest tightened, not from fear but from recognition. An old ache, familiar yet sharper now. Samuel Granger had been many things, brilliant, stern, curious. But he had never been afraid, not like this. A low rumble vibrated beneath the floorboards. Elias froze. It wasn't an earthquake. He had lived in the valley long enough to know how the earth shifted, how the ground whispered its unrest. This sound was different, short, metallic, purposeful, as though something underground had moved. Bear was already on his feet, body taut, ears pointed like arrows. Another faint tremor. And then, silence. A silence so complete it felt carved from stone. Elias rose from the table, instinct alert, memory sharp as broken glass. But before he could reach for his boots, Bear let out a sound Elias had only heard once, in Kandahar when a mortar dropped too close. A deep rising growl. He followed Bear's gaze out the window. Headlights, 2 of them, approaching slowly down the dirt road, cutting across the valley with surgical precision. A black SUV, polished, unmarked, exactly the kind that didn't belong in Redstone Valley. Elias stepped back from the window, breath tightening. Bear stayed rigid, hackles raised, a low vibration rolling through his chest. The SUV glided to a stop 30 yards from the house, dust swirling around it like smoke. 2 men stepped out. Even from the window, Elias saw the details. Pressed charcoal suits, shoes too clean for the valley, posture too controlled for ordinary visitors. They walked with the quiet confidence of men who were used to entering doors without knocking. Elias's pulse hammered. He didn't need introductions. He knew who they were, and worse, he knew why they were here. He opened the gun safe, not to take the weapon inside, but to remind himself it was there, that he was not helpless even if the law bent around these men like grass before the wind. The knock on the door was sharp, 3 precise strikes. Bear snarled. Elias exhaled once, steadying himself, then opened the door just enough to meet the men without exposing the inside of the house. The older one stepped, forward first. His hair was gray, neatly combed, his expression polite, almost warm, but his eyes were like polished stone. "Mr. Granger," he said in a calm, articulate voice. "My name is Carter. This is Pierce." The younger man, Pierce, nodded, jaw tight, eyes flicking over Elias's shoulder. Bear's growl deepened. "What do you want?" Elias asked. Carter smiled gently. "We're with the Department of Land Survey. There have been reports of unauthorized excavation on your property. We simply need to inspect the area and ensure you're not in violation of section." "Try harder," Elias cut in. The 2 men exchanged a fleeting glance. Carter didn't lose his smile, but his tone cooled by several degrees. "All right, Mr. Granger," he said softly. "We're not here to waste anyone's time. Something has been disturbed on your land, something that should remain undisturbed." Elias felt his jaw clench. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," Carter replied simply, "and we're here to help you avoid a very unfortunate misunderstanding." Pierce shifted slightly. "We need access to the northern pasture," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Now!" Elias didn't move. Bear stepped closer, muscles coiled. Carter sighed, an affected, practiced sound. Mr. Granger, please. This can be resolved easily. We are not your enemies. You're on my land, Elias said. At dusk, without a warrant. Warrants are for civilians, Pierce said. Elias's stomach tightened. He recognized the implication. Men like these didn't follow the same rules as everyone else. They operated in shadows where oversight dissolved into dust. I'm not letting you near anything, Elias said. The air tensed. Carter tilted his head slightly, studying him as if measuring the resistance left in an old machine. You have something that does not belong to you, he said softly. And we have a responsibility to make sure certain historical materials are properly contained. Historical, Pierce echoed. And hazardous. Elias felt Bear brush against his leg. The dog wasn't bristling now. He was trembling, a quiet inward shake Elias felt more than saw. Bear sensed something deeper beneath the men, something hidden behind their words. A coldness, a purpose. Carter smoothed a hand over his tie. Mr. Granger, if we cannot resolve this amicably, other measures will be taken. Elias swallowed the rising anger. You need to leave. Carter exhaled again, but this time the politeness shattered. His expression sharpened into something precise and dangerous. This is not a negotiation. Pierce took a step forward. Bear exploded. A thunderous bark ricocheted off the porch, echoing across the valley. The force of it startled even Pierce, who jerked back a half step. Carter's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but calculation. Elias held Bear by the collar, though the dog strained forward like a living barricade. I won't tell you again, Elias said. Get off my land. Carter studied him for a long moment, then gave a slight nod to Pierce. We'll return, he said calmly, next time without pleasantries. They turned and began walking back to the SUV. Halfway there, Carter paused and looked over his shoulder. One more thing, Mr. Granger, he said. Whatever your father left unfinished, you would be wise not to follow. The SUV drove off, leaving the valley unnervingly silent. Elias shut the door, locked it, then leaned his forehead against the wooden frame. Bear pressed against him, whining softly. I know, Elias whispered, voice thick. I know. Night settled deeper around the ranch, but Elias didn't turn on the lights. He moved quietly, as soldiers do, checking windows, securing doors, watching the horizon. Somewhere beyond the valley, the dust trail of the SUV still lingered in the air. Bear stayed close, sitting at every doorway Elias passed, shadowing him room to room. The whisper of the past had become a shout. Project Earthdive had not been forgotten, and now neither was he. For the rest of the night, Elias Granger slept in fragments, short, brittle pieces of rest that never crossed fully into dreams. Bear stayed awake the entire time, sitting at the foot of the bed with his head up, ears shifting with every distant rustle. The dog didn't lie down once, not even for a moment. By sunrise, the valley was filled with a strange haze, thin and pale as breath on glass. Elias stepped onto the porch, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. Bear followed, pressed so close his fur brushed Elias's leg. The air had changed, not warmer, not cooler, just waiting. Elias checked the horizon. No dust trails, no tire marks, no signs of the two men who had come last night. The SUV was gone, but the sense of being watched lingered like a smell that refused to fade. He took a long breath, steadying himself, then walked toward the barn to check the animals. Bear suddenly stopped, his entire body locked, muscles tightening under his dark fur. Elias looked down at him. What is it? A moment later, he smelled it too. Smoke. Not the faint scent of a distant wildfire. This was closer, sharper. Burning wood, burning hay, burning fuel. Elias ran. He sprinted across the yard toward the barn and stopped dead. Flames licked upward from the rear wall of the structure, bright orange tongues against the pale morning sky. Smoke billowed in thick, suffocating sheets. Bear barked, short, frantic, urgent. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the hose, yanked the valve open, and sprayed the back wall. Steam erupted where water met heat. But even in the chaos, he saw something wrong. The flames weren't spreading naturally. They formed a contained strip, deliberate, controlled, as though someone had laid an accelerant in a precise line along the back of the barn. His stomach clenched. Someone had set this fire. "Bear, back!" Elias shouted as burning debris fell. Bear leapt aside, narrowly avoiding a collapsing beam. Elias's mind raced. He had to get the flames under control before the fire spread to the rest of the ranch. The barn wasn't just storage. It was feed, tools, everything that kept the land alive. He fought the flames for several minutes, sweat burning into his eyes, smoke clawing at his throat. Finally, the fire began to die, leaving behind a charred wall, curling planks, and the reek of chemicals. Elias dropped the hose, chest heaving. Then he heard it. Footsteps, running. Not toward him, away. Bear bolted, barking furiously as he tore around the edge of the barn. "Bear, come back!" Elias chased after him, rounding the corner, and saw movement near the house. A dark shape slipping past the porch, heading toward the back door. Someone was inside. His pulse spiked. The fire had been a distraction. He sprinted toward the house, Bear already ahead of him, barking in violent bursts. As Elias reached the door, he heard a crash inside. He burst in. A man, broad-shouldered, dark. Jacket, gloves, stood in the living room, pulling open drawers, rifling through papers, sweeping folders to the floor, searching for the documents, the Earth Dive folder, the hatch photos, proof. "Hey!" Elias shouted. The man froze, then turned his head slowly. His eyes were cold, mechanical, like the men from last night. But this one wasn't here to negotiate. Bear lunged. The man swung his arm up just in time, but Bear's jaws clamped onto his sleeve, twisting his body violently. The man slammed into the wall, trying to dislodge the dog. Elias grabbed a chair and swung it, striking the man's back. The intruder staggered, dropping a device Elias hadn't noticed. A thin metal tool with wires and a digital light. Not a weapon, a scanner for documents. Bear yanked the man's arm again, hard enough that Elias heard a cry of pain. The dog's teeth sank deep. The man tried to kick him off, but Bear held firm, snarling with a fury Elias had never seen in him before. The intruder slammed Bear against the wall. Bear yelped, but didn't release. Rage flared through Elias. He charged, grabbing the man's collar and dragging him back. The intruder twisted, trying to elbow him, but Elias blocked it easily. Old instincts surged, the sharp clarity of combat, the muscle memory of years in uniform. With a firm pivot, Elias slammed the man down on the floor. Bear leapt, landing a final strike on the man's shoulder. The intruder gasped, then lay still, dazed, not dead, just beaten. Elias knelt, breathing hard. Bear stood over the man, chest heaving, growling low. "You picked the wrong ranch," Elias muttered. He tied the man's hands with a rope from the closet, one of the few things the intruder hadn't thrown around the room. Then he grabbed the phone. Before he could dial, Bear barked again. Not at the man, at the window. Elias looked up just in time to see a second figure sprinting across the yard, heading back toward the road. The man must have been waiting outside as lookout while the others searched the house. Cowards. Elias started to pursue, but Bear barked sharply, once, pulling him back. The fire, the smoke, the danger of leaving the ranch unguarded. Elias clenched his jaw. The second man escaped, but the first was tied up, and that was enough for now. He dragged the intruder outside, away from the smoke. Bear followed, keeping his body between Elias and the unconscious man. Elias dialed the sheriff's office. He didn't mention Earth Dive, didn't mention the hatch. Just said someone broke into his home and set fire to his barn. He knew how to lie when necessary. An hour later, deputies arrived. They loaded the man into the back of their cruiser. The sheriff, an older man named Garrett, took Elias aside. "You sure you don't know why someone would do this?" Garrett asked, scratching at his beard. "This ain't the kind of trouble we get out here." Elias shook his head slowly. "I wish I did." The sheriff frowned, glancing toward the burned barn. "This wasn't random. Someone wanted you gone long enough to sneak in." Elias said nothing. Bear stayed pressed to his leg, eyes locked on the departing cruiser. When the patrol trucks were gone, Elias sank onto the porch steps. Bear sat beside him, leaning heavily against his hip. The valley lay quiet again. Too quiet. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt hunted. Elias placed a trembling hand on Bear's back. "They're not going to stop." Bear rested his head on Elias's knee, warm and grounding. "And neither will we," Elias whispered. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the scorched earth. Somewhere under the valley, something shifted again. A faint echo pressed beneath miles of dirt. A reminder. A promise. Whatever Earthdive had left behind wasn't sleeping anymore. Night settled over the valley like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the last hints of color until only silver and shadow remained. Elias Granger moved through his house in silence, checking every door, every window, every latch. Bear padded behind him, breathing softly, his paws whispering against the wooden floor. The dog stayed so close that Elias could feel his warmth against the back of his legs. After the fire, after the break-in, after the man in the black jacket was taken away, Elias had imagined that a few hours might calm him. They didn't. If anything, the quiet made everything louder. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had begun, something larger than two intruders and a burning barn. Bear halted near the kitchen doorway. His ears pricked, his body stiffened. Elias froze. "What is it now, boy?" Bear didn't bark. Instead, he tilted his head toward the table, toward the old metal box sitting near the corner. The same box Elias had pulled from the hole in the earth days earlier. The metal was vibrating. Not much, just a faint tremor, barely visible. But it was enough. Elias stepped closer, heart thudding. He placed his fingers on the lid. The vibration pulsed through the steel. Once, twice. Then a low hum rose from deep inside, like a distant engine, or a machine waking after far too long. The sound lasted only 4 seconds before fading, leaving the house drowning in silence again. Bear whined softly and nudged Elias's hand, urging him away from the box. "I heard it too," Elias whispered. He didn't open it. Not tonight. Not when the valley seemed to be holding its breath. Instead, he carried the box into the back room, the one place in the house with no windows, and set it on a low table. He covered it with a thick wool blanket and placed his palm on Bear's head. "We'll deal with this in the morning," he murmured, but sleep never came, not fully, not peacefully. Just after 3 a.m., a sudden metallic clatter jolted Elias upright. Bear was already awake, standing on the bed with every muscle quivering. Elias grabbed the flashlight and rushed down the hall. Bear kept pace beside him. The back room door was cracked open, but Elias knew he had shut it. He stepped in carefully. The wool blanket had slid off the metal box and lay on the floor like it had been tossed aside. A thin beam of pale blue light leaked from the edges of the lid, faint but unmistakable. The vibration had returned, stronger now, rattling the small items around it. Bear let out a low, warning growl. Elias approached slowly, pulse hammering. He pressed one ear to the lid. Inside, beneath layers of rust and decades-old dust, a pattern thudded back. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a coded sequence, like a message. Elias pulled back sharply. "You have to be kidding me." Bear nudged him toward the hallway, anxious, insisting they leave. But Elias couldn't walk away. This time. Everything had pointed to something hidden beneath the valley, something designed, sealed, and forgotten. But forgotten things didn't call to the surface. They didn't send signals. They didn't wake up, unless they weren't dormant, unless something, or someone, inside had regained power. Elias's breath came faster. "This isn't just a government test," he whispered. "This is something else." His mind flashed to the instructions the intruder had snarled during the break-in, words he hadn't fully processed at the time. "We were supposed to retrieve it before the next cycle, before it activates." Bear stepped between Elias and the box, ears flat against his skull. Elias crouched, gripping Bear's fur. "It's okay. I'm not opening it. Not tonight." The vibration slowly faded. The faint light dimmed. Within a minute, the box was still again, as if it had never moved at all. But Elias could still feel the pulse of it in his fingertips, echoing through his bones. Dawn broke with a muted glow. A cold wind stirred dust around the ranch, carrying with it the faint smell of charred wood. Elias stood outside with Bear, staring across the fields. The earth looked calm, but the calm was fragile, like a glass surface stretched over something deep and shifting. He needed answers, not theories, not guesses, answers. Only one person might have them. Claire Barron, a geophysicist who had once worked with the private firm Earthdive before it collapsed under sealed litigation. Elias had worked with her briefly when she'd surveyed the valley's underground structures a decade ago. She had been brilliant, meticulous, and terrified of something she had found. She had left Earthdive shortly after and vanished into a teaching job in Santa Fe. Elias pulled out his phone. Bear leaned against his leg as he typed. It took 5 attempts before Claire finally answered. Her voice was thin with sleep and suspicion. "Who is this?" "It's Elias Granger, from Winter Mesa." Silence. Then, "Oh no," Claire whispered. "Not you too." Elias's stomach tightened. "Claire, something has started. I need to know what Earthdive found under this valley. I need to know what those 2 men were after." "I can't talk about this. Claire, they burned my barn down, broke into my house, and there's something buried under this land that's waking up." More silence, then a shaky breath. "Meet me at the old service tunnel outside Aguilar, noon. And Elias, don't bring the box." She hung up. Elias stared at the phone, stunned. Bear barked once, sharp, decisive. "Yes," Elias said. "We're going." The drive to Aguilar wound through empty plains and rock-strewn hills. Bear rode shotgun, alert the entire time. Elias checked the mirrors every few minutes. No cars, no black SUVs, nothing. But the emptiness felt wrong, too perfect, too still. At the edge of the old service tunnel, Claire Barron was already waiting, hood up, eyes shadowed, a folder clutched against her chest. She looked older, thinner, haunted. When she saw Elias, she didn't smile. "You shouldn't have called me." "You answered." Claire pushed a strand of wind-blown hair from her eyes. "Because I knew something like this would happen." Bear approached her cautiously. She reached a hand out, trembling, and let him sniff her fingers. "He remembers me," she murmured. "Good." Then she looked at Elias, eyes bright with dread. "What's happening? It isn't random. Earthdive found the cavity under your valley 14 years ago. But the readings weren't geological. They weren't mechanical either. They behaved like a pulse, like something signaling from deep underground." Elias felt cold. "And the box?" Claire swallowed hard. "Everything Earthdive kept above ground was tied to whatever is beneath it. The firm was shut down by federal contractors after one of the technicians went missing during a survey. They knew something was down there, something that wasn't supposed to exist." Bear bristled, glancing behind them. Elias's voice came out low. "Then what am I dealing with, Claire?" Claire looked at him with eyes full of fear, truth, and resignation. "Not a machine, Elias." She glanced at the ground beneath their feet. "Something alive." Elias didn't speak. Couldn't. Bear growled, a deep guttural rumble, and suddenly turned toward the distant road. Elias saw it a heartbeat later. A dust plume climbing into the sky. 2 vehicles, black, fast, coming straight for them. Claire's face drained of color. "They tracked your call." Elias grabbed her arm. "Get in the truck, now!" Bear leapt into the back seat as Elias started the engine. Gravel shot out under the wheels. The truck fishtailed before catching, engine roaring as they tore away from the tunnel entrance. Behind them, the black SUVs accelerated. The chase had begun. And the valley no longer felt like home. It felt like the mouth of something waking up, something ancient, something betrayed, something hungry. The highway unfurled before Elias Granger like a ribbon of steel cutting across the barren mesa. His old truck growled as he pushed the engine harder than he ever had. Gravel spat from the tires, dust rising behind them like a wounded comet tail. Bear stood braced in the back seat, paws planted wide, eyes locked on the road behind them. Claire Barron clutched the dashboard, her breath sharp and fast. "They're gaining on us," she whispered. Elias didn't need to check the mirror. He could feel it. an instinct that had never failed him. The two SUVs were closing the gap, their black frames slicing through the desert haze. "Tell me everything," Elias said. "If we're about to die for this, I want to know what we're running from." Claire swallowed hard, her voice trembling, not with fear alone, but with the weight of a truth buried too long. Earthdive wasn't mapping the valley for water, she said quietly. It was studying something older, something that didn't fit geological patterns. We believed it was a dormant organism, something massive, something that had fused with the land itself. She pressed her palms together. We thought it was long dead. Bear gave a low bark, urgent, warning. Elias glanced at the mirror. The nearest SUV swerved, accelerating. It closed the distance with brutal confidence, headlights glaring. "They don't want the truth buried," Claire continued. "They want it controlled." A metallic clang jolted them. The SUV behind had clipped their bumper. Elias gripped the wheel tightly. "Hold on." He jerked the steering wheel, swerving off the road, tires screaming as they ripped across the hardened earth. The truck bucked violently, bouncing over stones and ruts, but he kept it steady. The SUVs followed without hesitation. Bear barked again, 3 sharp warning snaps. "I know, boy," Elias said, jaw tight. "I see it." Ahead, the land dipped sharply toward the valley's dry ravine, a drop steep enough to wreck anything that didn't brace for it. Elias floored the accelerator. "Are you insane?" Claire shouted. "Always have been," he muttered. They launched over the edge. For 3 heart-stopping seconds, the truck hung in midair, weightless, suspended between terror and faith. Then the ground slammed up to meet them. The truck landed hard, skidding sideways, dust exploding around it. Elias yanked the wheel, straightening it just as the suspension screamed in protest. Behind them, one SUV misjudged the drop. It slammed nose first into the ravine wall and flipped, rolling end over end until it lay in a twisted heap of metal and black smoke. The second SUV landed better, but not perfect. It bottomed out, sparks shooting as its undercarriage scraped rock. "That buys us a minute," Elias said through gritted teeth. Claire stared at him with a mix of terror and awe. "What now?" "Now," Elias said, "we go home. Or—" The valley stretched ahead, the same valley that had raised him, scarred him, and betrayed him with its buried secrets. Bear stood tall in the back seat, muscles tense, tail stiff, watching every shadow. Elias turned the truck toward Winter Mesa, toward the ranch, toward the hole that had started everything. The tires slammed onto the familiar dirt road. The house came into view. The air shimmered with heat above the blackened remains of the barn. The land looked tired, scorched and bruised, but still standing, just like him. He braked hard, sliding to a stop near the north pasture. Bear leapt out before the truck fully halted, scanning the tree line. Claire staggered from the passenger seat, clutching her folder. "Why bring them here?" "Because they think they know what's buried," Elias said, striding toward the edge of the pasture. "But I've seen what they don't, and I'm done running." Claire's eyes widened. "Elias, what are you planning?" He didn't answer. Bear barked once, loud and commanding, as the remaining SUV roared up the trail toward them. Elias could see Tucker behind the wheel, face set in cold determination. Another man hung out the passenger side, rifle raised. Elias stepped to the old bulldozer and grabbed the ignition key from beneath the rusted frame. Claire gasped. "You're not—" "I am." He climbed onto the bulldozer, muscles tense as he turned the key. The engine groaned, coughed, then rumbled to life. But he didn't drive it forward. He drove it back, toward the hole, toward what lay beneath. The SUV screeched to a halt, dust curling around its black tires. The doors slammed open. Tucker stepped out, gun drawn, face calm. Too calm. "Elias," Tucker called. "Don't make this harder." Elias shouted over the bulldozer engine. "It's already hard. Everything you buried is coming back up." Tucker lifted the gun. Bear lunged. The shepherd launched into a sprint, teeth bared, a streak of power and fury. The man with the rifle swung toward him, but Claire dove forward, hitting his arm. The gunshot cracked the air, wide, harmless. Bear hit the rifleman full force, knocking him to the ground. Elias seized the moment. He dropped the bulldozer blade. Tucker shouted, "Don't you dare!" but it was too late. The blade ripped across the earth, shearing off the top layer of soil. The ground trembled. A low vibration rolled beneath them, humming up through Elias's bones. Claire stumbled, clutching the ground. "Elias! What did you do?" The tremor deepened. Bear backed away from the hole, ears pinned, growling at something beneath the earth. Tucker froze mid-step. The ground split. A narrow seam opened, just an inch, but enough to unleash a blast of air carrying a strange, ancient scent. Metallic, primal, alive. Elias felt something move beneath the dirt, slow, enormous, like a shifting continent. Claire stared in horror. "It's responding to the signal. Elias, it's waking." The earth pulsed again. Then, silence. Deep, unnatural, absolute. Tucker lowered his gun. For the first time, fear cracked his expression. "We need to leave, now. You don't understand what this is." "I understand enough," Elias said. He pulled a small object from his coat. The waterproof ammo can key. Tucker's eyes widened. "The originals. Where are they?" Elias nodded toward the earth. "Safer than you'll ever be able to reach." The tremor faded. The earth stilled. Whatever lived beneath had stirred, then quieted, but not in anger, in recognition. As though it knew its evidence, its story, had been protected. Tucker took a slow step backward. The man Bear had pinned groaned, trying to rise but failing. "You can't stop this," Tucker warned. "No," Elias agreed, "but I can keep the truth alive." From the ridge came a sound. Sirens. State police. Ben Sullivan leading them. Elias allowed himself a small, weary smile. "Time's up," he told Tucker. Bear growled a final warning as officers poured into the pasture. Tucker and his surviving operative were quickly surrounded, disarmed, and cuffed. Claire sank onto the grass in exhausted disbelief. Elias turned off the bulldozer and stepped down. Bear immediately pressed against him, trembling slightly as the adrenaline drained. Elias knelt and wrapped his arms around the dog. "You did good, boy. Better than anyone." The officers moved the prisoners away. Ben rushed toward them, chest heaving. "Are you two alive?" he gasped. Elias chuckled, rubbing Bear's ears. "We're always alive." The sun broke over the mesa at that moment, gentle, warm, cutting through the morning cold. Light spilled across the valley floor, over the damaged barn, over the broken ground, over the place where something ancient had chosen, for now, to be still. Claire stood and looked upon the land, her voice soft. "Whatever that thing is, it trusts you." Elias shook his head. "No, it trusts Bear." Bear licked his hand, tail giving one slow, contented wag. Elias looked toward the horizon. "Come on, boy," he said gently. "Let's go home." And together, man and dog walked back toward the house, toward the life they had fought for, toward a future no longer haunted by secrets buried in the dark. The earth behind them remained quiet, but not asleep. Never asleep again. In the end, this story reminds us that even in the darkest corners of our lives, God sends us signs of hope. Sometimes that hope arrives quietly, the way the earth hums before it awakens. Sometimes it comes in the loyalty of a faithful dog, and sometimes it rises in our hearts when we choose courage over fear. God's miracles are not always loud. They are often the quiet moments that guide us, protect us, and lift us when we feel forgotten. Just as Elias and his loyal companion stood against secrets buried in the ground, we too face battles in our everyday lives. And yet, every day, God gives us strength to keep going, to rebuild, and to believe that no story ends in darkness. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of hope. Leave a comment below and tell us what you felt. And if you believe in the quiet miracles of God, write amen in the comments. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps wherever you are. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.